featuring Darold and Barbara Bigger. Q&A with our live audience. And host, Anil Kanda. Today's episode, Could You Forgive a Murderer? And here's your host, Anil Kanda.
For those of you who are familiar with the Lord's Prayer, it can be humorous when kids try and repeat it without fully understanding it. According to some kids, they understand it as, "Our Father who art in heaven, how do you know my name? Give us this day our jelly bread and forgive us our trash baskets as we forgive those who put trash in our baskets." The topic of forgiveness is a hard one to talk about. It's hard to get rid of the trash in our baskets. And we may feel that some people have put a lot of trash in our baskets. Today, Dr. Darold Bigger holds workshops teaching people about forgiveness. Dr. Bigger has served as a professor, a pastor, and a Navy Reserve chaplain, finishing his career as Rear Admiral, Deputy Chief of Navy Chaplains, and Director of Religious Programs for the Navy, Marine, and Coast Guard Reserve, for which he was awarded the Navy's highest non-combat award, the Distinguished Service Medal. But it's not these things that make his workshop so powerful. Because about 28 years ago, Dr. Darold and Barbara Bigger were thrust into an unimaginable tragedy, which we'll introduce through this news clip, which will roll right away.
Police say Shannon Marie Bigger last talked to family or friends on Sunday at 4 p.m. By Sunday night, no one was able to reach her. And this morning, relatives had the manager open up the first-floor apartment. According to police sources, it was a bloody scene inside. Investigators will not release a cause of death, but sources indicate there was severe head and neck trauma. And investigators are looking into the strong possibility of a sexual attack. Shannon Bigger, originally from Walla Walla, Washington, apparently lived in the apartment for less than a year. She had been working at the Washington Adventist Hospital Foundation in nearby Tacoma Park. Investigators took bags of evidence from the apartment. They will not say what, if anything, was stolen from Bigger, or if there is any sign that the attacker forced his way into the apartment.
It's one thing to watch a news clip. It's another thing to have lived it. The Biggers have an incredible story to tell of their journey through it all, and we are privileged to have them share that with us today. Please welcome to Hope at Night, Dr. Darold and Barbara Bigger. Thank you so much for being here. Let's start off first by honoring the memory of your daughter. Could you tell us what she was like?
She was a chatterbox, for one thing. Didn't give you a lot of personal space. I'd have to say, Shannon, back up a little. She was very religious in her life. She was a firm friend of God's. Loved people, but wouldn't stop talking.
Yeah. And she enjoyed helping other people.
Yes.
Devoted a lot of her time to being support and encouragement to others.
That's phenomenal. Take us back to that day when you heard the news. What do you remember about it?
I was at work. I was managing a campus bookstore at Walla Walla College. It was college then. And I got a phone call from our campus chaplain saying, "I have a personal matter of some urgency. Can you come to my office right now?" And I could not quite imagine what a personal problem would be. I thought maybe that our other daughter, Hillary, was home that weekend. We had been gone, and did she get into trouble while we were gone? She was in a friend's wedding, so I couldn't quite imagine. But anyway, when I got to the chaplain's office, he was very quiet, which was not like him. Said that we were waiting for Darold to come. That was the first I knew. And
I had gotten a call at my office that morning also from John, the chaplain, asking if I could come now. I tried to delay him until afternoon, and he said, "No, I need to see you right now." So I was a bit frustrated that this interrupted my plan of the day, right? And when I walked in, Barbara was there, And it all comes back, doesn't it, Barbie?
And he came around his desk and he said, I have the worst possible news I could share with you. Shannon has been killed. And at that point, my brain sort of stopped, I think, and I envisioned a car wreck, actually. She was working here in Silver Spring, and I thought, I know where she drove to work every day, and there was a 5-way stop, and I wonder how many other people were involved in this accident. And then I heard the words, she's been murdered. And I sort of felt like the blood just drained out of me or something. I was in such shock I couldn't even cry at that point. But Darold cries easily, so when he cried, I cried.
I started crying immediately.
Yeah.
That's overwhelming to hear.
Yeah.
That's the worst news any parent could ever receive.
Yeah.
When the details started to emerge, what did you find out?
Well, the details at first were quite different than what actually happened in many ways. But we found out that some person had gotten into her apartment and slashed and stabbed her to death multiple times. And then we learned that the detectives and police, actually my cousin's husband, who lived here in the area at that time, found her.
She didn't show up to work on Monday morning, and they called her apartment. There was no answer. Her answering machine didn't come on, and that alerted them. So they sent him to the apartment to see
check it out. And he said he went into the apartment not wanting to really, but he sort of felt compelled to go in, and he saw her hand on her bed. She was lying on her bed, and he saw her hand below the bedspread. And anyway, he went down to the office, and they called the police. They were there instantly and started working on that case. And we're so grateful to Montgomery County first responders and everybody that helped us. It was good.
I can't even begin to imagine how both of you were able to operate anyway after this whole experience. But do you remember some of the things that took place with your community, with your friends, and with your family during this time?
We didn't operate very well for several days and weeks and months, actually. Yeah. But that very day, our pastoral staff from our church were there to help us, just to get us home from work, and discovered that there were already college administrators there waiting for us, and we were absolutely surrounded with love and help. We were very, very fortunate.
They had made arrangements if we wished to be in touch with the police who were investigating the case. And so we got early and regular updates from them. It was a pretty disorienting time. And for months afterward, I went for almost a year and did not read a single book because I just didn't have any words in my mind and didn't want to fill it with anything.
That's a grief that's too overwhelming. I mean, I'm so thankful God carries us, even when we don't even know how to connect with Him in those moments. Was the murderer ever caught?
Very quickly, which is amazing to me. It's a whole miracle story in a way. There was a surveillance camera at Shannon's apartment, at the only entrance to get into the buildings there, and there was a van that didn't belong there. And long story short, they went looking for this van, discovered that it had been stolen from about a mile away, and then the license plate had been changed. Anyway, they drove for hours looking for this van. Pulled in the wee hours of now, she was found, she was killed on a Sunday, found on Monday, the wee hours of Tuesday morning. They were still looking and decided, this isn't gonna be fruitful. And at Georgia Avenue, one of the big, of course, intersections, they were stopped at a stoplight and the white van pulled up beside them. They let it go ahead, and sure enough, there's the license plate they're looking for. Turned out the driver at that time was not he said he knew nothing about the murder, but his partner in crime did, and he told them where to find Anthony, and they went and found him in his mother's place. He had apparently a downstairs apartment in her house, and found him in bed watching Shannon's television set, and he had her computer and flute and other things. So,
what was his motive?
We don't know. That's the hard part. We don't know how he got in. We don't know why he chose her. Another woman, after this was big 6 o'clock news, and after his picture was shown on TV here, another woman called and said, that's the man that tried to get into my place and follow me. So there's no evidence that he ever stalked Shannon, but this other woman, they said, had similar characteristics to her, so I don't know.
Right. Do you remember the court case?
He pled guilty. I mean, who does that? Nobody pleads guilty to things, it seems to me. But he did, and because of that, there was no trial, only a hearing and a sentencing. And of course, we came for that, and he was sentenced on Good Friday. This happened in June, and that following March is when he was sentenced.
That was our first observation of him. We hadn't seen him at all before. I remember sitting in the courtroom, and Anthony sat with his head down during most of the testimony from the detectives and the psychiatrists and psychologists who had worked with him. When the state's attorney made his final appeal to the judge, he concluded his remarks, the attorney concluded his remarks by pointing at Anthony and saying, this man who committed this heinous crime deserves to spend the rest of his life in his own private hell. And at that, Anthony looked up and gave him the finger. And that's the image we left in our minds of the man who had slaughtered Shannon.
That's so terrible.
No remorse
Yeah.
at all, and that was hard.
After the court case, after all of this, do you remember much of the journey you had as far as spiritually? I mean, I don't even know, as I said before, how you begin to even pray in moments like this, go to church, those kinds of things. But do you remember some of those moments you had where you just sensed God being there, being very present, in spite of how you felt?
I remember not blaming God at all. I was really mad at Satan. And one night I was driving our pickup and in the rain home, and I cried my eyes out and I pounded on the steering wheel and I said, "You're not gonna win. I hate you, Satan, but you're not gonna win." And that was my big release. And from then on, it was okay to go to church and talk to God and talk to other people. I was okay. Darold had a very different journey.
Yeah, it was more difficult for me. The grief transitioned to anger toward Anthony when several months later he appealed his case. He wanted to change his plea to not guilty, and he wanted his sentences reduced. And internally, that just infuriated me. This man who had admitted he had done this now wants to get out of taking the consequences to which he had agreed. For goodness sakes. I was furious. I had taught a stress relief class the previous quarter. And every week we got together and did some stress relief exercises at the beginning of class. So I knew all that stuff and I tried to do it. And it did not work. That quarter in school, among the other classes, I was teaching a Christian spirituality course where we talked about prayer and meditation and releasing our burdens to God and making God be a part of our regular life. And that didn't take the knots out of my stomach or relax my fists. I was just internally in turmoil. Early in the summer, we went to church, and the chaplain who had told us about Shannon's death that infamous day was speaking that week, not knowing anything about what had been going on in my life and my attempts to let go of this rage. And he used as a text Jesus' statement that other people will know you by the way you love one another. And my mind went from that verse to another one, and Jesus saying that we should love our enemies and do good to those who hate us and despitefully use us. And I sat there that morning condemned because I had failed to do that. I'd tried to do that now for several months, and it was not working for me. So I felt like a horrible sham of a Christian pastor.
Well, I can imagine, those feelings that were going through your mind, especially as a man. You feel this, it's your daughter, and this guy takes the life of your daughter, and it's like this, he's in jail, and you feel this helplessness of wishing you could be there, wishing you could have stopped this from taking place, and now it's, even the justice is completely out of your hands in dealing with this. You can understand why you felt the way that you did during those moments. Even when you was hearing the word of God and the pastor talking about loving your enemies, I can understand why that challenge would be there to even love somebody like this. No remorse, no shame. That's challenging.
It was.
We're going to hear more about this story and just some of the ways that God led you through this. Dr. Darold and Barbara Bigger received the worst possible news about their daughter that a parent could ever receive. When we come back, they'll share how they took the law into their own hands. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Hope at Night. We're dealing with a very sensitive topic today. Earlier, Darold and Barbara Bigger shared the tragic story of their daughter's murder. After dealing with this tragedy, they decided to take the law into their own hands, God's law. Now let's talk about the Lord's Prayer and why this is important. The Lord's Prayer says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That's not easy. And I know you had been wrestling with this. Could you elaborate a little bit more on it?
Yeah, can I introduce it?
Yeah, absolutely.
By finishing the story of what happened to me that Sabbath morning in church. I felt like a Christian failure, a professional, I was a pastor, for goodness sakes, right? Religion teacher. I, of all people, should know how to do this, and I couldn't get it done. In the seconds after that dawned on me, I ended up identifying myself with Anthony, who had killed Shannon. That I was as much a risk to him as he had been to her. Because I was so enraged at him that the barbed wire and brick walls protected him from me. It was a horrible discovery for me. And in the discouragement of that realization, my mind went to another verse where Paul says in the book of Romans, we all have sinned and God loves us the way we are. And to realize that God loved me when I hated myself was a transforming realization for me. It had been easier, I think, most of my life to believe that God could love me at my best. If I do well enough, then I can see why God might respond positively to me. But when I'm a horrible failure and I hate myself, why would God ever reach out to me then? Very seldom would someone die for another person, but maybe if they were a really good person, someone might be willing to die. But God shows his love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And that, letting that truth sink into me made almost an instant change in my internal life. When we walked out of church that morning, I realized the knots in my stomach were gone. My fists were relaxed. My jaw wasn't tense anymore. And before I got out of the back door of church, I remembered that a resentment I had carried toward a colleague who had misrepresented me and I felt betrayed me. That hurt was gone as well. And it flabbergasted me that what I had tried to accomplish all of those months and hadn't done in an instant was done. How did this happen? And that's what sent me scrambling into the subject of forgiveness and how it works.
Do you remember the conversation both of you had with each other in deciding to forgive?
I don't remember that we really talked about that. Maybe, do you remember that?
No.
I just knew in my heart that I had to, or it would eat me up.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the saying goes, you drink poison and wait for the other person to die.
Right.
And I couldn't live with that. I'd heard it through the news and stuff about Anthony's upbringing and home life. Not that that was an excuse for what he did, but it may help me understand maybe where he was coming from, and it was not as hard for me to say, this man needs to be forgiven.
Barbara's naturally a much more forgiving person than I am.
Yeah, I live with him.
That's right. And 58 years of experience with this woman have reinforced that for me. I know that she forgives easily. It's more difficult for me. So, to realize that God forgave me before I did anything confronted me with that phrase in the Lord's Prayer. I had always sort of unconsciously assumed that when Jesus uttered that phrase, forgive me for what I've done because I forgive other people for what they've done, that I have to initiate that process, that I act first and God responds to me. And that's not what happened to me. And we find other places in the New Testament that illuminate that as well. Colossians, for example, where Paul says, forgive one another as Christ has forgiven you. The has forgiven happened first. Jesus forgave us. And then that empowers us to let go of our hurt toward other people. that experiencing forgiveness gives us the gift that we pass on to other people.
It's the recognition that this is an undeserved gift that
Yep.
we receive from God. And it allows us to bestow that same blessing even upon our enemies.
Well said. A contemporary researcher, Everett Worthington, calls forgiveness an altruistic gift. That gift we give someone else who does not deserve that.
What would you say to the person who is struggling right now, maybe to forgive another person? Maybe it's a viewer who's watching, maybe one of our audience members, and they have been having this bitterness in their heart, their very soul, to forgive someone who has betrayed them, someone who has hurt them. Obviously, not on the extent that both of you have experienced, but what would you say to that person?
I would say that forgiveness of other people begins with accepting our own failings. Not necessarily in that relationship, but to recognize that we ourselves are frail and imperfect and make bad mistakes and have hurt other people. And accepting that about us makes it much easier to accept other people's failings that are hurtful to us.
And we just need to realize that God has forgiven us, and what a huge gift that is. And then you can give that, pass it on. Unless you recognize your own need, I don't think that it works very well.
So the story of forgiveness is really a story about God,
Yeah.
not about Barbara and Darold or any other human beings. This is the
gift.
living epitome of God's gift to us.
Yeah.
You know, I think of an example of Saul in the book of Acts, who was contributing to the stoning of one of the disciples. And it was Stephen. And Stephen, in his final prayer, said, "Lord, do not lay this charge upon him," you know? And eventually this led to this murderer's conversion, who ends up participating in the book of Acts and writing much of the New Testament. The power of forgiveness really has power to change and transform in ways we don't always understand.
Yeah.
You bet.
And of course,
Great
Jesus
illustration.
on the cross, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. It's, I wouldn't say it's a command, but it's certainly very good advice.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, in regards to Anthony, the murderer of your daughter, I'm sure as we are recalling some of these things, those emotions, those intense feelings return, those memories come back. Sometimes the moments where you just wish you could just rewrite the past. How does forgiveness come into those moments? How do you operate with Anthony now in your mind, in your heart?
We're not allowed any direct contact with him at all. We can't write letters, no phone calls, certainly no visits. So it all does have to be in our mind, in our own lives. We have come to understand the process of forgiveness as a cycle, not an event. And every time those feelings resurface, we have to go through the steps again of acknowledging our own inability to be what we wish we were, and accepting God's forgiveness of us, and experiencing the freedom from our own regrets and guilt. And that allows us to be charitable toward Anthony.
Barbara, what about you?
That's a good question. I really don't think about Anthony a lot anymore, except when we do seminars and things. And I have to remember that he needs my forgiveness. Like Darold said, it's a process that we go through again. The real hard part for me came when I felt convicted that I had to pray for him. How could I pray for this man who had slaughtered my daughter? So I had to ask God to help me even want to pray for him. I said, I can't do this. And eventually I was able to, and so I can still do that. I pray that somewhere along the line he'll meet somebody in prison. He's there for the rest of his life, plus another life sentence, plus 20 years. So he's not going anywhere else. And I'm hoping that a chaplain or other inmates will touch him in some way and help him understand that he's forgiven, not just by us, but by a power much greater than us.
One of our previous guests has once said that Jesus is the best and worst thing that can happen to sinners. You know?
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
God knows how to minister and the way to minister. He knows how to reach hearts so deadened by evil and sin. Now, you wrote a book, A Time to Forgive, very relevant title. What's in this book?
The first part of the book is about the story of what happened to us and the journey of grief that we went through, and then some reflections about how to live in the aftermath of that. It's a little bit of my experienced philosophy of life, I think, toward the end. Coming to grips with who I am as someone quite imperfect, but accepting God's love and forgiveness of me in spite of myself. I have come to believe that that is the hardest job of Christian people. It's not to live up to whatever standards they think they need to follow. The hardest job for us is to accept the fact that Jesus accepts us as we are before we've done anything.
You know, I always say the two hardest thing a Christian will have to do is take the gospel to the world and then take the gospel to their own heart.
Right. There's a lot written and research done now about self-forgiveness. And I've come to believe that phrase itself is an oxymoron. We don't forgive ourselves. We accept forgiveness from others of us. And that's what becomes transforming.
When you're doing these workshops on forgiveness, and people have heard these workshops, they've heard this incredible story and journey of God's goodness in the midst of all this tragedy, what is the response of those that are attending the workshop?
Barbara gets, I think, much more personal responses than I do. I tend to be more theoretical, and she's more experiential.
Usually I hear other stories of terrible things that have happened in people's lives. Usually not murder, although we've encountered 2 or 3 of those, but just very difficult, a lot of abuse. That's been really hard. And women especially, but some men too, they just pour out their stories to me, and we commiserate and remember that God loves us and helps us through that. The abuse, I think, would be very hard because many of these people are living in this community or whatever. The perpetrator is alive, and for us, you know, it's over in a way because Shannon is gone and we can't be in touch with Anthony, so I feel very sad for them, for people that experience that.
It does remind us, too, that the events that trigger the hurt and pain may vary from one person to another, and our story is not a story that fits everybody, but we all carry pain and difficulties in our lives, and that pain is what needs to be addressed by the process of forgiveness. And forgiveness is primarily for us, not for the person we forgive. It benefits us. Physical and mental health studies verify this repeatedly, that people live longer, are healthier, have less mental health struggles, all if they are more forgiving. And we can learn how to do it. We can practice.
What you're sharing is so important. I think this is something that we struggle with every single day. We have pent up, bitterness in our heart. Sometimes we run into people, and there's this unforgiving spirit that sometimes we inculcate into our day-to-day existence, and we're not even aware of it. I got to ask you practically, how does one live with this spirit of forgiveness constantly? Just in how they operate in relationship. Doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen. Doesn't mean people aren't going to be jerks, mean to you. Sometimes, obviously, it's a messy world. It's a broken world. But how do you live continually with the spirit of forgiveness?
I have to keep reminding myself. And there are lots of reminders. Things that irritate me or that make me upset. Things that hurt me or bother me. All of those are invitations to practice forgiving.
That's beautiful. Thank you, both of you, for sharing. I know we have some more to talk about when we come back. With a topic like this, we have barely scratched the surface. But when we come back, we're giving our audience the opportunity to share their reactions and ask their own questions of Darold and Barbara. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I am joined by Darold and Barbara Bigger, who tragically lost their daughter to murder. In response, they decided to take a path of forgiveness. As we further explore their story, I would like to invite our audience to share their questions to our guests. Who has a question for our guest today? Right over there.
Have you ever blamed or questioned God for what happened to your daughter?
I have not blamed God. I blamed the devil, Satan, but I did not blame God. I felt that he was the only one really who understood how I felt, because he had lost a son to murder too. And that gave me comfort.
That's a very profound question, because it goes to how does one explain evil in the world in all kinds of ways, not just in our situation. And I'm comfortable with the Bible's description of how bad things got started and how we as human beings perpetuate those, and that in a tragic sense, evil and bad things are part of our human existence. God has an ultimate solution for that, a better world beyond this one that will be an eternally happy and pleasant one. So I choose to see God as a solution rather than the cause of trouble.
You know, the Bible says the enemy comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. But Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and life more abundantly.
Yeah.
That's the difference between those two, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Right over there.
Do you think that heaven has room for people like Anthony?
Well, a question we sometimes get is similar to that is, are there some things that are so bad, some people that are so evil that they ought not to be forgiven at all? I rely on God's promise that when Jesus returns, we will all be changed. We who have accepted Jesus into our lives, accepted God's forgiveness, that at that moment we'll be transformed and changed, so that the Anthony or people like Anthony that I would meet in heaven would not be the Anthony who took Shannon's life. It will be a different person, one who is supportive and helpful and loving. So yes, I think there would be room for that Anthony who has been transformed by the grace of God.
Right. Heaven is going to be a place for all kinds of people, but not people who have continued in what they're doing, but as you put it, people who have accepted this grace that God offers, and their hearts have been transformed by that grace.
We've made presentations in several prisons, and have met people in prison who are different than when they went there, whose lives have changed during
For the
that
better.
short period of time. Yeah, for the better.
For the better.
Yeah. So I never want to give up hope on another human being who is open to accepting God's presence in their life.
Beautiful. Any other questions?
What advice would you give those who may seek the path of vengeance rather than forgiveness?
They're in for a long haul of heartache and sorrow their whole lives. And it bothers me when I hear people on TV usually saying, I want justice, when I think really often they mean I want vengeance. And I would hope that they could somehow let go of that horrible anger. It just eats you alive. As Darold mentioned earlier, it just makes your whole physical body and mental health, and it puts you in a terrible place. A good movie about that. What was the name of it?
I don't know which one you're talking about.
Sean Penn and Nicole Kidman.
Oh, The Interpreter.
The Interpreter. There's a great line from Hollywood in there that vengeance is a lazy form of grief.
Vengeance doesn't bring peace.
No.
Either.
Not at all, no. And where does it end? You have vengeance, and we see that all over the world, especially nowadays in the wars. And it just never ends.
And if you add to that the studies that have nothing to do with religion about physical health, mental stability, relational harmony, all of those things are undermined by vengeance and enhanced by forgiveness. So, was it Einstein, Barbara, who said?
The weak want revenge and the strong want do forgiveness.
Yeah, so vengeance is for the weak and forgiveness is for the strong.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
How you and another daughter overcame the loss of her beloved sister?
Oh my, our girls were so different.
And even the two of us are different too.
Yeah.
We each one have responded differently to this process.
But for Hillary, it was very difficult. There were times, they were like this when they were in the same room, and buddies when they were a continent apart. But she would often say, I wish I was an only child. And now she was. That was hard for her. She didn't want to become an only child like that. So there was a lot of guilt at first, I think, a survivor's guilt. But now she's doing well. Because of this, we learned through this whole process that often siblings of violent crimes and homicides don't have children of their own. Hillary was engaged at the time this happened, has since married and been married now for 27 years. But we thought we would never be grandparents because of this. But then thankfully a friend of hers had a child that she held in her arms right after it was born, and she said, I think I want one of these.
That was it.
So we do have 2 grandchildren by her from her, and she's doing okay now. But it's still hard. She doesn't talk about her sister a lot. Yeah. She did organize a 50th birthday party for Shannon. We went up to the cemetery, and Hillary brought balloons, and we had cake and ice cream, and sat around her grave and told stories and had a wonderful time. Some people might think that's weird, but for us it was good.
That's okay. When it comes to celebrating somebody's memory, that's a beautiful thing. It's how we cherish that and keep the memory of the good. Now, there's just a question I have. I'm sure lots of people came up to you and were like, why are you so forgiving of them? Why would you be so forgiving of Anthony? I'm sure people were just like, I would do something else. Yeah. And you probably heard that within your community, maybe some relatives, others who were just upset that you're not as angry as they are. How'd you cope with that?
For me, it was self-preservation, actually. Maybe that's a little selfish, but I couldn't live with this anger and angst, and that would make life miserable.
Right.
Shannon would not want us to be miserable.
That's right.
So.
And I think, at least for me, experiencing the gift of forgiveness from God, for me, for my anger and rage, was so freeing that I want to share that with as many people as I can. So that's part of what has launched our writing and workshops that Barbara and I do, as a way of letting other people learn how to reach out to this God who gives us this gift of letting go of all of that stuff that just torments us.
Where do we find out more about these workshops?
I don't know. You look up Biggers in Walla Walla, Washington.
Yeah, I think a Google search will find us pretty quickly.
Yeah.
We do those in churches and communities whenever we're invited. Early on, we committed ourselves, because we were so overwhelmed with what God had done for us, we committed ourselves to share our story whenever anyone asked to hear it.
I'm sure we'll share the info on how to get a hold of both of you. So
it's on the back of the book, for whatever that's worth. Yeah.
Any other questions? Right over there.
Do you think Anthony was possessed with a demon when he committed the crime?
I don't know what you may mean by possessed with a demon. I think there are, the evil in the world is all the result of the evil one and ones. And I personally believe that there are evil beings in the same way that there are divine beings. I believe there is a God, and I believe there is a devil. And I believe the devil is the source of all the evil that we face in the world. There are some people who, for a variety of ways, may become what we refer to as possessed by the devil, or demon possessed. And in that supernatural way, I don't know that that would be necessary to have done what Anthony did. There are many people who do horrible things without being under the supernatural control of something outside themselves. Each one of us has the capacity to do plenty of evil things on our own without very much external help. And that's why being in touch with a God who invites us and channels us to positive things is so important for daily life.
It's very crucial, isn't it? You know, especially, obviously we see things like demon possession in the Gospels. We don't know how we can classify it these days, but for sure we can sense Satan is part of maybe some driving the evil, instigating this evil. But I'm so thankful too for a God who also instigates grace and mercy and brings good out of all the evil that sin causes. Right?
And that reminds me of a great sermon I heard from a wonderful pastor one time who talked about all the bad things in the world, and at the end of each paragraph he would say, "But I have been to the end of the book." We know what the final conclusion of human history is going to be. And those of us who have confidence in the Bible's description of that know that it will all end well in spite of the bad things that are going on in the shorter term.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Right over there.
Having lost most of my family members, I feel anxious whenever I receive a call or a message. How can I overcome this fear? Also, it's like so difficult to see my parents or my family. Like whenever they receive a call or a message, it's like, who's next? It's in that sort of like situation. And we are people who believe God a lot. And even after so many prayers, it's just the same thing, who's in the line. So it's like that. So I don't know like why God is like punishing, or we don't know what's happening. But how can we overcome this fear, at least like to live peacefully the life.
After 9/11, the attack in Washington, I was assigned to a family in Virginia. We called them and told them we were going to come and see them. And the father of the daughter whom we were going to report her death, the father was a retired Navy person and knew what our arrival would mean, and said to us on the phone, "We don't want to talk to you." Because of that anxiety. We don't want this bad news. We want to push it away from us. And if somehow we could keep from hearing about it, maybe it wouldn't happen at all. The sad reality is that grief is dealt with when we experience it and face it. You see some impact of that from me, just thinking about those sad things in life. And for us to grieve is a part of human existence. I love what Paul says in encouraging Christians who are facing tough times. We don't want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, and grieve as those who have no hope. You'll grieve, but you will grieve with hope because of the end of the story of God's promises to redeem us from all of this pain and sorrow, and to walk with us. You remember the 23rd Psalm, the God who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death. So in the meantime, God is with us, and He promises us the ultimate solution at the end. And for that hope, I would pray for you and encourage you to continue to pray for yourself.
Well said. God doesn't want us to operate through life with constant fear. Yes, we do live in a broken world, and yes, we'll get those phone calls.
Yeah.
But God wants us to keep in mind hope.
Yep.
And the way you described it, the hope of the second coming. Mm-hmm. And that should be something that we live and allow to shape our lives continually. Mm-hmm. All said. Any other questions?
Can you describe the feelings you experience when you realize you've forgiven someone? And is it similar to any other feelings that you've had?
I have never thought of that before, but it's intriguing to me. And yes, there is a kind of sensation, a physical sensation that comes to me. When I'm disoriented or upset, even about smaller things at a lower level, and in this case, when I was able to let go of that pain toward Anthony, it was a relief, like a big, deep sigh. When I do therapy with clients, and I hear after a tense exchange or memory that they're sharing, when I hear them, I say to them, that is the best sound in the world. Relief from having to carry that burden and be all tied up. And that's what it is for me. It is the ability to relax and to live life not in terror, but in hope and trust in the God who sees us through tough times.
Mm. Any last words, Barbara?
He said it very well.
By the way, both of you are a very cute couple. So,
thank you.
Darold, Barbara, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I know it wasn't easy. I know it's challenging, but I'm also thankful for the hope that both of you have expressed. I hope not just for the future, but a hope that today God can work in the midst of these tragedies and bring good out of it. Mm. I know your story has blessed many people, our viewers, myself, and many more will continue to be blessed by that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
When we've been hurt by someone else, it's tough to follow the call to be the bigger person and to forgive. But the powerful story of Darold and Barbara Bigger and their decision to choose forgiveness over revenge challenges us to reflect on how we can handle pain and hurt in our own lives. I want to encourage each of you to consider the areas in your life where forgiveness might be needed, whether it's forgiving others or even forgiving yourself. The Bible teaches that we are all sinners, and that our sin is what murdered the Son of God on the cross. But it also says that if we turn to God and seek forgiveness, He will forgive us, not because we deserve it, but because of His grace. And that is what empowers us to extend forgiveness to ourselves and others. Forgiveness is a powerful act of faith that trusts that He is a God of love and justice. And He tells us that vengeance is His, not ours. It isn't easy, but as we've seen tonight, forgiveness can bring healing and peace in ways that revenge or bitterness never could. Forgiveness may not forget all wrongs, but it does mean that we refuse to let those wrongs define us or our future. To forgive is to set a prisoner free, and to discover that prisoner was you. And knowing that God's love is way bigger than this hurt is what gives hope at night. Take care and God bless.